3 trucks, 1 furious woman, a 48-hour ultimatum. At 6:14 in the morning, Catherine Whitmore stood outside Logan Mercer's gate, smiled at his electric fence, and threatened to have it torn down by force. Logan said only 4 words back: "Put it in writing." What Catherine didn't know was that she had just handed a former federal security expert the exact evidence that would end her career, expose a hidden multi-million-dollar land grab, and turn her own signature into the reason she lost everything. Logan had been sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee looking east across the frozen fields when the 3 white vehicles rolled up his gravel drive. Catherine Whitmore climbed out first, followed by 2 board members and a man in a jacket stitched with the words "property compliance." She did not wait for a greeting. She pointed straight at the fence line running along the northern edge of his land and told him it was an unauthorized hazard. Logan asked calmly, "Unauthorized by whom?" Catherine answered that the association governing the community had the authority to make that determination. Logan looked past her shoulder at the empty road behind the trucks and reminded himself that his ranch sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest Silver Pines property line, that he had never signed on to any association, and that no such organization appeared anywhere in his deed. She handed him a violation notice. 48 hours to remove the fence or the fines would begin $1,000 for every day it remained standing. If he refused, contractors would be authorized to enter and dismantle it themselves, with the cost added as a lien against his land. Then Catherine said something that stayed with Logan far longer than any of the numbers. She told him the association had access rights through his property. Not the fence, not the money. Those 2 words, access rights, were the ones that made him go still. Because in 16 years of working around power infrastructure and land disputes, Logan had learned that people rarely mention rights they don't secretly doubt they have. He didn't raise his voice. He photographed every page of the notice while she watched, then asked her directly whether what she had just told him represented the official position of the Silver Pines board. Catherine, confident, said absolutely. Logan told her that was good and asked that everything else be delivered to him in writing from that point forward. Then he closed the gate. Catherine stood on the other side, visibly irritated that a man facing daily fines hadn't so much as flinched. When Logan went back inside, he opened the fireproof safe in his study and pulled out an old folder of survey documents, and on top sat a hand-drawn map from 1978 showing a thin red line crossing straight through what was now Silver Pines land, with a small note in the corner that read, "Temporary utility access expires upon termination of power agreement." He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, tracing the red line with one finger, remembering how many disputes he had settled over exactly this kind of language back when he still worked for the federal contractors. He had learned long before he ever moved to Red Hollow that people who genuinely held a legal right rarely needed to threaten anyone to use it, and that the loudest claims of authority were usually the ones with the thinnest paperwork behind them. Outside, the sound of the association trucks faded down the frozen road, but Logan didn't feel relief. He felt the particular stillness that came before a long, methodical fight, the kind he had trained for without ever expecting to need those skills again on his own land. He set the map aside, poured a second cup of coffee, and began writing down everything he remembered about the morning while it was still fresh. Every word Catherine had said, every gesture, every name on the paperwork she had handed him. 3 weeks before that confrontation at the gate, Logan had noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across an old dirt road along the northern edge of his property, a route so overgrown it had nearly vanished into the brush. He assumed hunters at first until he installed a camera and caught a Silver Pines maintenance truck opening the old gate the very next night. 2 men driving straight through his land toward an abandoned substation near the base of the ridge. He wrote a polite email asking the association to stop, and Catherine answered in 17 minutes flat, insisting that Silver Pines retained permanent access rights. When Logan asked for a copy of the easement, nothing arrived. 3 days later, the truck returned, so he locked the gate himself, and the next morning found the lock had been cut clean off. He called the local sheriff's office, but because there was no significant property damage and the association was claiming a right of access, the matter was treated as a civil dispute rather than a crime. Logan replaced the lock. 2 days after that, Catherine sent a letter warning that interfering with community infrastructure could expose him to liability, and it was that letter more than anything else that pushed him to install the electric fence. But Logan was not some inexperienced rancher stumbling into a fight he didn't understand. For 16 years, he had designed perimeter security systems for energy facilities, written risk assessments, worked alongside state inspectors, and testified as a technical expert in lawsuits involving electrical safety and land access, which meant he built that fence the way he built everything else. In his old career by the book, every post sat entirely inside his property line. The warning signage matched required spacing. The voltage stayed within legal limits, the power unit was certified, and an emergency shutoff was wired into the system before it was ever switched on. He even hired Carter Hayes, a state electrical inspector, to run an independent evaluation, and Carter signed off with a single word stamped across the report: compliant. Logan hadn't built the fence to hurt anyone. He had built it to draw a line. Catherine could no longer pretend not to see, and one evening his cameras caught her standing directly in front of it with a contractor beside her, pointing at a section of post, while the man pulled a cutting tool from his truck. Logan called the sheriff immediately, and they left before anyone arrived. Installing the fence had taken him the better part of 9 days, working alone through frost and wind, sinking each post by hand, and testing every connection twice before ever connecting the power. He posted the required warning signs at precise intervals, matched the voltage to the lowest setting that would still deter trespassers without causing lasting harm, and wired in a manual override switch mounted inside his own barn so the entire system could be shut down in seconds if needed. Neighbors who drove past sometimes slowed to look, some nodding in quiet approval, others frowning at the sight of it, but none of them said a word to him directly. Logan didn't build it as a statement. He built it the way he had once built containment barriers around live substations, with the assumption that someone someday might try to test it, and that when they did, the evidence of exactly what happened needed to already exist before the argument even began. The next morning brought an email from Catherine claiming his obstruction had now become a documented safety emergency. Logan read the sentence twice, then opened a new folder on his computer and labeled it evidence. The very first file he saved wasn't one of her messages at all. It was a video time-stamped 11:43 at night of Catherine standing on his land, her voice caught clearly by the camera's microphone, saying that once the fence came down, he wouldn't be able to stop the road project. Logan had never heard of any road project. So instead of calling her back or firing off an angry reply, he sat down at his desk and began quietly searching public records, because a man who spent 16 years reading fine print in federal infrastructure contracts knew exactly where to look. What he found was a filing called the Silver Pines Ridge Expansion, a plan for 42 luxury homes, a clubhouse, and a small artificial lake, with individual properties priced between $900,000 and $1.4 million. There was just one problem buried in the county's conditions of approval. The development needed a second emergency access route before the final phase could be permitted, because the existing road into the community was too narrow to meet code. And the cheapest possible route for that second road ran directly through the old dirt path on the northern edge of Logan's ranch. Without it, Silver Pines would be forced to build an alternate road around the ridge at an estimated cost of $3.8 million. Suddenly, the fence, the threats, and the fines all made perfect sense to him. Catherine didn't care about a fence at all. She needed that road, and she was trying to stretch a decades-old, long-expired easement into something permanent enough to build a fortune on. Logan spent 2 full evenings cross-referencing county planning submissions, zoning maps, and press releases from the Silver Pines sales office, printing out every page and spreading them across his dining table, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Marketing brochures for the Ridge expansion already advertised a projected completion date less than 18 months away, and one glossy rendering even showed a paved secondary road curling through terrain that matched the exact contour of his own northern boundary. He realized then that Catherine hadn't simply stumbled onto a convenient shortcut through his land. She had built an entire sales campaign around the assumption that the shortcut would eventually belong to her, whether or not the law actually agreed. Logan pulled the original 1978 agreement and read it line by line. 48 years earlier, the local power company had been granted temporary use of that dirt road solely to maintain a transmission line with the access explicitly tied to the life of that agreement. The transmission line had gone dark in 1996. The substation closed for good in 1998. By every legal measure, the easement had already expired, yet the current Silver Pines development map still labeled that same stretch of road as a permanent community access easement with 2 critical words quietly swapped out somewhere along the way. Logan called his attorney Ryan Caldwell that same night, and Ryan arrived within the hour to look through the documents spread across the kitchen table. After several minutes of silence, Ryan finally asked if Logan understood what he was looking at, and Logan said someone had changed the description. Ryan shook his head and told him it was worse than that someone had built an entire development plan on top of a right they very likely never had. He advised Logan not to confront Catherine directly, and instead let her keep writing, because every threatening letter, every fine, every claim of access she put in ink was becoming evidence against her own case. When Logan asked whether the fence should stay up, Ryan simply smiled and told him to keep it exactly where it was. Catherine sent a second notice within days, the fines now climbing past $4,000, along with a demand for an emergency meeting. Logan refused to meet in person and insisted every future communication be delivered in writing, a decision that led directly to her biggest mistake. In one email trying to pressure him into compliance, she wrote that Silver Pines possessed an unrestricted and perpetual right of passage across the northern Mercer property. Ryan read those two words aloud, twice unrestricted, perpetual, and told Logan that Catherine had just put her lie in writing under her own name. The very next morning, an envelope arrived from the county clerk's office, confirming that Silver Pines had filed a formal notice of claimed easement interest against Logan's land, signed under oath by Catherine herself, and dated weeks before she had ever pretended to discover the expired agreement. From that point forward, the fines climbed relentlessly, $5,000, then $8,000, then $12,000, arriving alongside a 6-page letter from the association's attorney threatening an emergency court order, a temporary access ruling legal fees, and a lien against the ranch itself. Catherine also began speaking publicly, describing an unnamed, hostile neighboring landowner interfering with community safety in the monthly Silver Pines newsletter. And though she never printed his name, everyone in the community understood who she meant. Strangers began writing to Logan directly, one warning him that if an ambulance couldn't reach the new homes because of his fence, that would be on his conscience. A claim Logan quickly disproved by checking the emergency route plans, which never touched his property at all. At a community gathering he had no part in, Catherine stood in front of nearly 60 residents and described the situation as a matter of basic public safety, framing herself as the only person standing between the neighborhood and disaster. Several attendees later told Logan almost apologetically that they had believed her completely at the time, unaware that the man they were quietly resenting had never once refused reasonable access, only refused to sign away permanent rights, under threat. Letters kept arriving at his mailbox for weeks, some polite, some furious, a few outright accusing him of endangering children who didn't even live anywhere near his land yet. Logan kept every single one, filing them alongside the rest of his growing archive, understanding that public pressure built on a false premise was in its own way just another kind of evidence. Ryan wanted to respond publicly and correct the record immediately, but Logan told him, not yet, drawing on a lesson from his old career, that when someone is actively building a false record, sometimes the smartest move is to let them keep building it. He created a master timeline cataloging every date, every phone call, every email, every video clip, every fine, every one of Catherine's public claims, and every planning document tied to the ridge expansion, labeling each piece as an exhibit until he reached number 37. Ryan looked at the stack and asked if Logan used to prepare federal case files for a living, and Logan simply said technical disputes, prompting Ryan to laugh and tell him to remind him never to threaten a man like that in writing again. The following weeks brought a strange quiet to the ranch, the kind that made Logan more uneasy than the constant letters had. He kept the cameras running around the clock, checked the fence circuits every morning before sunrise, and made a habit of walking the full property line each evening just to be certain nothing had shifted overnight. Ryan warned him that quiet periods in disputes like this rarely meant surrender, that they usually meant the other side was regrouping, gathering new leverage, or waiting for an opening Logan hadn't yet closed. He turned out to be right. Catherine eventually drove out alone without the board or the compliance officer this time, and offered Logan a deal on the spot, erasing every fine in exchange for his signature on an agreement, allowing the association to use the northern road. When Logan asked whether that use would be temporary, she went quiet, and when he asked directly whether it was permanent, she brushed the wording aside as merely technical language. He asked her point blank how much the ridge expansion was worth, and for a single second, something shifted behind her eyes before she claimed not to know what he meant. Logan told her they had nothing further to discuss, and as she turned to leave, she asked if he really believed a fence could protect him. He told her no, and pointed instead to the small camera mounted on the post beside them, telling her that records do. At 2:17 in the morning, an alert lit up Logan's phone warning of a circuit interruption along the north sector of the fence. Rather than run outside blindly, he pulled up his camera feed and watched 2 trucks and 4 people gathered near the fence line, one wearing a Silver Pines reflective vest cutting a section of wire away from an insulator. Because Logan had designed the system with isolated zones, the affected section shut itself down automatically the moment the wire was breached, and the cameras switched to continuous recording without him ever needing to step outside. He called the sheriff first and Ryan second, and when Ryan groggily answered, Logan told him people were on the property, prompting Ryan to snap fully awake and warn him not to confront anyone under any circumstances. Logan stayed inside and simply watched as the men opened the gate, drove a truck through, and began setting up survey equipment rather than any kind of repair tools, confirming. This had nothing to do with fixing a fence and everything to do with mapping the road Catherine wanted so badly. When the sheriff arrived, the men claimed to be Silver Pines contractors, with an authorized easement producing paperwork bearing Catherine's signature. though deputies still ordered everyone off the land until a court could resolve the underlying dispute. The next morning, Catherine emailed Logan, accusing his fence of endangering authorized association personnel, and when Logan forwarded the message to Ryan, without comment, Ryan replied with only 3 words: "We file today," and by that afternoon, a lawsuit had been drafted seeking full confirmation of Logan's ownership rights, a declaration that the old easement had expired, an injunction against future trespassing damages and attorney's fees. Silver Pines answered with a countersuit, and Catherine called an emergency board meeting where she accused Logan of weaponizing an electric barrier against community personnel, language Ryan found almost laughable once Carter Hayes's inspection report confirmed the system had automatically shut itself off the instant it was tampered with, that no one had ever been harmed, and that the very people who had entered the property had triggered the shutdown themselves by cutting the wire first. 3 days later, Ryan called with news from the discovery documents Silver Pines had been legally required to hand over. When Logan asked whether they had found anything useful, Ryan paused before telling him that Catherine had known the easement was expired long before she ever appeared at his gate. Buried among thousands of pages of routine invoices and maintenance logs, Ryan's team found a 3-year-old email from Margaret Doyle, the former Silver Pines treasurer, warning Catherine directly that the 1978 easement had already lapsed, and that the association should stop, displaying that road as permanent community access on its planning maps. Catherine's own written reply instructed staff to leave the map exactly as it was until development options were finalized, a phrase Ryan placed directly in front of Logan as proof she had known the truth all along. A separate email from an outside planning consultant went even further, warning that without the Mercer route, the alternate road would cost at least $3.8 million and could threaten the viability of the entire expansion project. Barely a month after that warning landed in her inbox, Catherine's letters to Logan began. Ryan told him plainly that this had never really been about the fence at all, and Logan agreed, though Ryan corrected him gently, saying the fence may well have saved him, because if Logan had never built it, Silver Pines might have quietly continued using the road indefinitely, slowly building a claim, through years of uninterrupted use. Ryan explained that in property law, silence could sometimes be treated almost like consent, that years of unchallenged crossing could eventually be twisted into an argument for a right that never legally existed, and that Catherine likely understood this far better than she ever let on. By forcing her to declare her position loudly and repeatedly in emails, in letters, in a filed legal notice, Logan had unknowingly closed off the one path that might have actually worked in her favor, the slow, quiet one. Ryan admitted it was almost poetic, that the very aggression Catherine used to intimidate him had ended up being the thing that guaranteed she could never simply wait him out. The fence forced Catherine to state her position out loud in writing over and over, and in trying to pressure Logan into surrender, she had unknowingly documented her own intent. When Ryan reached out to Margaret Doyle, she initially refused to speak with anyone. But after Logan called her himself and simply mentioned that her email was already sitting in the discovery file, she agreed to meet, arriving 2 days later at Ryan's office with a flash drive she had quietly kept for years out of concern over Catherine's decisions. On it were minutes from a closed board session in which Catherine had said Mercer would eventually sell or cooperate, that all the association needed was enough pressure applied over time. When a board member asked what would happen if Logan sued, instead Catherine had answered that he was only one man while the association had a legal budget behind it. Logan listened to the recording without visible anger, only asking Ryan afterward whether they could use it in court. And Ryan told him without hesitation that they absolutely would. A week before the hearing, Silver Pines offered to settle, wiping out every fine, paying Logan $75,000 and abandoning its claim over the fence entirely in exchange for a signed agreement granting the association permanent use of the road. Logan looked at the number for a long moment, and when Ryan asked what he wanted to do, he slid the offer back across the desk and said simply, "Court." The county courthouse was packed the morning the case was heard, filled with residents from Silver Pines who had come to watch. Catherine arrived in a dark, tailored suit flanked by 3 attorneys radiating the same confidence she had carried to Logan's gate months earlier, while Logan wore a plain shirt and Ryan carried nothing more than 2 boxes of documents. Reporters from a regional paper had picked up on the dispute after the countersuit was filed, and a small handful sat near the back of the room with notepads open, curious whether a rancher with no legal background could possibly hold his ground against an association with a full legal team on retainer. Logan didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the 2 boxes beside Ryan's chair boxes that represented nearly 4 months of documentation, collected one careful entry at a time. The association's lawyers opened by describing the fence as an aggressive, electrified obstruction, insisting the community held a long-standing right of access, framing every action as necessary for public safety, and portraying Logan as a landowner acting purely out of spite. Ryan let them finish without interruption, then called Carter Hayes to the stand, who confirmed under oath that the fence was fully legal, properly certified correctly, signed automatically disabled when tampered with, and had never caused a single documented injury to anyone. When Ryan asked Carter directly whether he would classify the system as an illegal electrical hazard, Carter answered with one word, no, and just like that, the association's central safety argument collapsed in front of the entire courtroom. Ryan then introduced the 1978 survey map, and when the opposing attorneys argued the easement had simply been inherited over time, Ryan asked them to read the termination clause aloud themselves. The room fell silent as the judge asked when the underlying power agreement had ended, and Ryan answered 1996, followed by the judge asking when the substation had been decommissioned, to which Ryan answered 1992-8. When the judge turned to Silver Pines' counsel and asked how their client could possibly describe this as perpetual access, the lawyer could only say it reflected the board's understanding, prompting Ryan to respond that perhaps it was time to examine exactly how that understanding had been formed before calling Catherine Whitmore to the stand. Catherine walked to the witness box and was sworn in, and Ryan approached holding a single printed page that Logan recognized immediately as Margaret's warning email. Ryan asked when she had first learned that the 1978 easement might have expired, and Catherine answered recently. Ryan glanced down at the page in his hand and asked whether 3 years earlier would qualify as recently, then displayed the email on the courtroom screen for everyone to see her name, her address. The original date and the warning about the expired agreement laid bare for the entire room. When Ryan asked if she remembered receiving it, Catherine claimed she didn't recall, so he produced her own written reply, instructing staff to leave the map exactly as it was until development plans were finalized, and read the line aloud a second time so no one could mistake its meaning. Catherine tried to explain it away as a routine administrative decision, prompting Ryan to ask whether routine administrative decisions typically involved quietly converting temporary utility access into permanent community access on official planning documents. When the opposing attorney objected, the judge allowed the question to stand, and Ryan followed by placing two versions of the same map side by side on the screen. The original 1978 survey and the current Silver Pines version, highlighting the two words that had been silently changed between them. Catherine was forced to confirm under oath that she herself had approved the updated map, after which Ryan pivoted to the ridge expansion itself, walking her through the 42 homes, the projected value in the tens of millions, and the $3.8 million cost of the alternate road, before asking whether the expansion became substantially more expensive without access across Logan's land, a question she tried to sidestep until the consultant's own report left her no room to deny it. Ryan pressed further, laying out one fact after another in rapid succession, that she had known the easement was expired, that she had known the development needed Logan's land, that she had continued marking the road as permanent access, anyway that she had fined him $1,000 every single day, and that she had authorized contractors onto his property at 2:17 in the morning. When Catherine insisted it had all been done for community safety, Ryan played the camera footage of the men carrying survey equipment across the property that night, then asked Carter directly what kind of equipment it was, and Carter confirmed without hesitation that it was standard land surveying gear. Nothing related to electrical repair or emergency. Response. Turning back to Catherine, Ryan asked what kind of safety emergency required a land survey at 2:17 in the morning, and for the first time all day she had no answer at all. Ryan then played the recording from the closed board meeting, Catherine's own voice filling the courtroom as she said Mercer would eventually sell or cooperate, that all they needed was enough pressure, and he asked her plainly whether the daily fine had been part of that pressure, whether the threatened lien had been part of it, whether the forced entry threat had been part of it, whether sending contractors onto his land in the middle of the night had been part of it. Several jurors seated for the related civil matters exchanged glances as the recording played a second time at the judge's request, and one of the Silver Pines board members present in the gallery lowered his head, clearly recognizing his own voice among the murmurs captured in the background of the tape. Catherine's attorneys tried to argue the recording had been obtained improperly, but Margaret Doyle, who had recorded the meeting herself as treasurer for the association's own internal records, calmly explained from the gallery that the recording had always been standard practice and fully authorized under the association's own bylaws. To every question, she answered no, until frustration finally broke through, and she blurted that Logan had been blocking a project that would benefit hundreds of people, a statement that instantly undercut every safety justification she had offered all afternoon. Ryan let the silence sit for a moment before asking softly whether it had in fact always been about the project, and the look on Catherine's face made clear she understood exactly what she had just admitted far too late to take it back. The judge called for a recess, and as Catherine stepped down from the stand, she avoided looking anywhere near Logan's side of the room. Ryan leaned toward him and said quietly that the fence case was effectively over, and when Logan asked what came next for everything else, Ryan glanced toward the row where the Silver Pines board members sat and told him that part had only just begun. When the court reconvened, the judge ruled that the 1978 easement had terminated decades earlier, that Silver Pines held no legitimate right of access across Logan's land, that his electric fence was entirely lawful, and that every fine imposed against him was void from the start. The association was ordered to formally withdraw its claimed easement filing from the county record, and a permanent injunction barred Silver Pines and its contractors from entering the property again under any circumstances. The judge went further criticizing the association for continuing to assert an access right long after receiving internal warnings that no such right legally existed, and the questions of damages and attorney's fees were sent forward for a later hearing, with Silver Pines ultimately responsible for the bulk of Logan's legal costs, along with the damage caused by the trespassing and the destruction of his property. The findings regarding Catherine's sworn misstatements were referred onward for further review by the appropriate authorities, and she sat motionless as the ruling was read, though the greater cost to the association still lay outside the courtroom entirely. Without access across the Mercer property, the second road for the Ridge expansion simply didn't exist, and the county's approval for the project's final phase was placed on indefinite hold, forcing Silver Pines back to the far more expensive alternate route. With updated survey work and rising material costs factored in, that alternate road now carried a price tag of $4.6 million, a number that spread quickly through the community and ignited real anger among residents, not at Logan, but squarely at Catherine once the discovery emails proved she had known about the risk for 3 full years and chosen silence instead of honesty. Homeowners who had already put deposits down on lots in the Ridge expansion found themselves facing months of delay with no clear answers, and several began asking pointed questions at board meetings about where the association's legal budget had actually gone. One resident, a retired accountant, requested a full breakdown of every dollar spent fighting Logan in court, and when the figures were finally released, the total legal spending alone was enough to have funded a third of the very road the association had been trying to avoid paying for in the first place. Had she approached Logan as an equal from the very beginning, a fair agreement might easily have been reached, but she had chosen daily fines, unauthorized entry, and false legal claims instead, leaving the entire community to absorb legal bills and a frozen development in the aftermath. A week later, the board convened a special session and demanded Catherine's resignation as chairwoman, and when she tried to insist that every decision she had made was meant to protect the community's property values, Margaret Doyle rose from her seat and asked why in that case Catherine had buried her, warning about the expired easement instead of acting on it. No one in the room spoke up to defend her, and the vote to remove her from leadership passed without discussion. Even the 2 board members who had once ridden alongside her to Logan's gate that first freezing morning sat in silence, unwilling to attach their names to hers any longer, and one of them later confided to Margaret that he had never fully believed the road project was worth the risk Catherine had taken but had gone along because she made refusal feel impossible. By the end of the meeting, Catherine gathered her folder and left through a side door rather than walk past the residents still lingering near the entrance, a small detail several people in the room would remember long after the dispute itself faded from conversation. 2 days after that meeting, as Logan repaired a section of fence post, a car pulled up outside his gate, and this time it wasn't Catherine, but the association's newly retained attorney, carrying an envelope and telling him the board wanted to make him a formal offer. Logan glanced toward the old dirt road to the north, then back at the fence, standing firmly in front of it, and asked whether they still wanted access, to which the attorney answered that they wanted it very badly indeed. The new board's proposal came without threats, without fines, and without vague language of any kind, offering Logan real compensation for a legitimate, clearly defined easement. And though he was under no obligation to accept anything, he agreed to negotiate on his own terms this time. He required the road to shift east away from the original path near his home, with Silver Pines covering the full cost of a sound barrier and proper drainage along the new route. He required that the right of use be strictly limited to emergency traffic and a small number of clearly specified purposes, with no language resembling unrestricted or perpetual access anywhere in the final agreement. And he required that any future changes to that access require his written consent, along with full public disclosure to residents of every legal cost the association had incurred throughout the dispute. The board accepted every condition without objection, and Logan received fair market compensation for the easement determined through an independent appraisal, not because Catherine had ever forced his hand, but because for the very first time Silver Pines had come to the table, as an equal rather than nodder, an adversary wielding threats. Ryan drafted the final agreement himself, reading each clause aloud to Logan twice before either of them signed anything, making certain no vague phrase or quietly shifted word could ever again be used to stretch a limited right into something it was never meant to be. When the papers were finally notarized, the new board chair, a soft-spoken engineer named Douglas Farrow, who had replaced Catherine after the vote, shook Logan's hand and told him the association owed him an apology it could never fully put into words. Logan simply nodded and said that an apology mattered far less to him than a document that actually meant what it said. In the weeks after the settlement, Logan watched the survey crews return to the northern edge of his land, this time with proper permits pinned to their clipboards, and a courteous foreman who knocked on his door before every visit to confirm the schedule. The new road took shape slowly through the spring, curving well east of his home exactly as he had required, and the sound barrier the association funded turned out sturdier than he expected, cutting the noise of construction down to little more than a distant hum by the time work reached its final stretch. Margaret Doyle sent him a short note once the project was finally approved, thanking him for never once making the fight personal toward her, and Logan wrote back that she was the reason the truth ever reached daylight at all. Carter Hayes stopped by twice more that year, not for inspections but simply to see how the ranch was holding up, telling Logan once that in all his years as a state inspector he had rarely seen a case where the paperwork told such a complete story on its own. Months later, as the winter snow finally melted and new grass began creeping up around the fence posts, the electric fence still stood exactly where Logan had built it, a small sign fastened to one post, reading simply "Electric Fence Private Property." Ryan stopped by one afternoon and looked out at the line of wire, remarking that technically speaking the fence hadn't been what won the case. Logan took a slow sip of his coffee and agreed, and when Ryan asked why he was keeping it up anyway, Logan looked out toward the new road being built far in the distance and said that boundaries only mean something when people can actually see where they stand. Catherine had lost her position at Silver Pines, the ridge expansion had been delayed well over a year, and the association had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, surveys, and settlements. All of it had started with one simple choice the moment Catherine looked at a fence on land that wasn't hers, and instead of asking why it had been built, decided her authority was large enough to walk straight through it anyway. She was wrong. Logan Mercer had never built that fence to start a war. He built it only after being threatened, trespassed against, and pressured again and again, and when Catherine finally dragged him into a courtroom, he did exactly what he had spent his entire career doing before that morning ever came. He had seen enough disputes over land and power and access to know that the loudest voice in the room rarely turns out to be the one telling the truth, and that patience properly documented tends to outlast anger every single time. Red Hollow settled back into its usual rhythm that year. Quiet mornings, frozen fences, cattle moving slowly across frost-covered fields, and a single line of wire still humming faintly along the northern edge of a piece of land that had never once needed anyone's permission to belong to the man who owned it. He brought the maps. He brought the timeline. He brought the records. And in the end, it was that evidence, not anger, not confrontation, that showed the entire courtroom precisely who had truly crossed the line. Catherine threatened him over an electric fence, and by the time the judge finished speaking, the fence was still standing, but her authority was not.